Hey, this is Linzi Hawkin. You are listening to the Vinny Brusco Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Vinny Brusco Show.
And here we go.
Hey, Vinny.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good. Give me just 2 seconds.
Take your time.
I just ran in the door because I was going to do this at the studio, and then word on the street is that there's a snowstorm coming. So I was like, I'm going to go do it from home.
All right. You have a snowstorm coming your way as well?
Yeah, but so snowstorms, snowstorms, that's hard to say. Snowstorms here are like complete novelty. Like, we don't really get snow here. So what's quite funny, this is very British. Sorry, I'm taking my shoes off as I talk.
Don't worry about it.
It's very British in that we're not very good at any kind of extreme weather, right? Like, we can't deal with extreme heat. We also can't deal with extreme cold. So when like a sprinkle of snow is on its way, the whole island is like, freak out, you know?
Yeah, but you live in a very small island.
Oh yeah, like really, really small. But I find it kind of funny because I've lived in lots of other places where weather like that, I lived in Australia for a long time. So it's like, you know, I can deal with extreme weather, but it always makes me laugh when I'm back home and everyone's panicking because it's, you know, sprinkling or it's just a little bit warmer than everyone would like it to be. So
People like to find a reason to complain, though.
well, yeah, there's that too. There's that.
That's a big factor in all of it, is that people just like to find a reason to complain.
Yes, very true.
I mean, we have, I don't even know how much snow we have at this point, probably close to 2 feet of snow.
No way.
Yeah. So, and we're supposed to get another, it's supposed to snow 9 out of the first 14 days of February.
Wow.
Yeah.
You see, that's the thing. So here, like literally everything shuts down. Like if I woke up tomorrow and there was like 2 inches of snow, everything will be shut. Schools, buses, airport, everything will be shut.
They did shut down schools today. Everyone was remote learning, but it didn't even snow today. Like, they were saying, oh, it's going to snow and everything like that, but it didn't even snow today.
Huh.
So I'm in Westchester, New York.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah. So we got pelted by a bunch of snow, but you know, I enjoy it. Like, there's something to it, the seasons for me that I like to have.
Yeah, I'm the same. When I lived in Australia, I feel like so many people, or at least on this side of the world, have this vision of what it would be like to live there. And it is amazing and it is hot and sunny every day, but it actually kind of sucked. Like, I really missed the seasons when I lived there because, you know, like growing up here, you know, you were so used to like that excitement of the summer coming and like just those transitions. And without them, I was like, yeah, felt a bit lost, really.
Yeah, you need, like, the seasons kind of give you an opportunity to like reset energetically as well, where like if you're in the same season all year round, you're kind of like, all right, well, like, when do I put on a coat?
Yeah, you'd be finding excuses and like sweating, being like, I'm gonna put jeans on today just because you wanted to wear jeans, but it definitely wasn't cool enough, you know.
My buddy lives in LA, and I'll see him, like, you know, whatever, he'll like have a picture or whatever, and he has like a leather jacket. I'm like, you're in California, you don't need a leather jacket. Like,
you never need it. Yeah.
you're wearing a costume right now. You're simply wearing a costume, which is fine. I'm all about it, but you don't need a leather jacket right now.
So true.
So you're in Jersey, which is like a very small island. You were born and raised there, correct?
Yeah. So Jersey is 9 miles by 5. And it's in the English Channel, so it sits much closer to France than it does England. But yeah, I was born here and have lived here. Well, I lived here, like, obviously all my growing up, and then bounced around. I mean, I've traveled a lot. This last year is the longest time I've spent here since I was maybe 16, I think. Lived in southwest of France for a while, lived in Australia for a while, and then spent good chunks of every year, you know, just on the road. But yeah, it's a pretty rad little island.
And you live in a tiny house.
I live in a tiny house. Look, I can give you a tour. It won't take long. That was it.
There's something very romantic about tiny homes, especially like, I don't know if it's an American thing, I'm not sure, but I like every Sunday I watch Bryce and Tiny Homes Big Living, and I watch him go on these tiny house tours. And there's something so romantic and novelty about it that I'm just so intrigued. And I'm like, yes, I could do that. Wife and 2 kids, not sure if it would be a little tighter.
Maybe.
Especially in quarantine, but there's something very, how did you get into a tiny house?
Well, for a long time I had no house, no house, because I was traveling so much, right? So there was almost never a need for a home. And then, like the first apartment I ever bought was when I was living in France, and it was a tiny apartment. It was probably smaller than this tiny house. And I loved living in that place. And then I did the thing that you're supposed to do as an adult, and you sell that and you buy a bigger place, and then had a place in Oz, and that was like, the dream house. And then when I came back to Jersey, I was like, okay, well, I'm traveling so much. I don't need a lot of space. I don't want a lot of space. And I just want somewhere that I can just drop my stuff and feel like is mine. And my parents had a big kind of field behind their property. And so I just managed to like wangle into a conversation one day with my dad. I was like, I could build a cabin in your field. And and a friend of mine is a carpenter. And so I kind of designed it with him. And that was maybe like 3-4 years ago now. And yeah, it's a dream. It's like exactly it's like 29 square meters. It's like, for me, it's like perfect.
Yeah, there's something very like, again, like I think it's a bandwidth thing, right? Like when I converted to a very minimalistic wardrobe, right? I kind of like, I still have a lot of shit, don't get me wrong, but I really downsized a lot of stuff. People are like, are you okay? Is everything okay? Like, what are you going through? I'm like, no, I have like limited bandwidth, and I'm not going to waste any of it on a t-shirt that I'm going to wear, or like what pair of jeans or 9 pairs of sneakers am I going to choose?
Yeah. It's funny because when I first moved to Australia, I was married at the time, and we shipped, or we did what most people do when they move countries, is like you fill. So I think we filled half a shipping container of stuff, and it got lost, and I can't even remember what happened. It was supposed to go to Sydney and it went to Brisbane. Something happened. Anyway, it was lost for like 6 months. And I remember when the truck arrived with all our gear 6 months down the line, I was like, I can't even remember what was in there. Clearly we've survived without any of it. And so as we're like unpacking it all, it just became so obvious to me. I was like, why do we have all this stuff? We don't need it, And so actually moving back here, and I'd spent such a long time pretty much living out of a bag that I didn't actually have anything. Do you know what I mean? Other than like my clothes. Like the thing that I was most excited to buy when I moved in here was just like, oh, I can have somewhere for my books. I was like, I grew up in a house I was always surrounded by books. So I was like, oh, it feels good to have books again. But other than that, yeah, like I don't need anything. And I think the funny thing is when you step it down and you go minimal, I don't think you can go back because everything seems slightly pointless,
Don't get me wrong. I'm not even close to like minimalistic. Like I still have, you could tell I have a Boba Fett helmet in here. Like I still have a lot of crap.
Yeah.
But the reality is I stuff I hold on to, the things I do keep that are in eyes view are serving in some capacity, right? Some of them are just purely decorative. Other ones are just kind of serving. But when it comes to like clothing or any of that stuff, like I really just try to like hone it in on some stuff, because again, like that bandwidth and occupy, I rather, like you said, I'd rather have books and read and have all that stuff rather than just a bunch of crap. And you don't even miss it. Like you said, like you don't even realize it's gone.
No, not at all. It's hilarious. And the bonus is now I feel like I get given way better gifts now because, and my sister, it's hilarious. I have an older sister, and she's like one up me because she lives on a boat. So she actually lives in a smaller space than I do. But I feel like we've both now got this in common where like gifts are great now because you basically have a blanket rule where you're like, don't buy me any stuff. Like I can't have it. And it's not like when you used to say that to people because you didn't want stuff and they bought it anyway because you had a big house to fill it with. And now, like, my parents, so my mum is French, so it's all about food. So now, like, gifts are just food, which is amazing.
Sure.
And like gifts from friends are like plants, or you know what I mean? It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's all things that kind of serve well, right? They're all things that kind of add to your life rather than just a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
How did you get into the line of work that you're doing with, Protect Blue and Plastic Free Jersey and some of the other work you're doing?
Oh wow, I have a very like squiggly path, I guess. So
Don't we all?
All of it?
And I said, don't we all? Well,
Oh,
it's
right.
all squiggly path.
No,
Who's
right.
linear?
No, I don't know. So I was like the kid at school that didn't. So I went to like a very very like traditional all girls school. It was a very linear school actually, and I didn't really fit in at all. And it was the kind of school where if you weren't going to become a doctor, a teacher, or a lawyer, they were like, we just don't know what to do with you. And so they sent me off at 18 to this place in the southwest of England to do a course on marine leisure, because they were like, oh, she surfs, she likes the ocean, you should do that. And I went to university for, I think I stayed 3 weeks, and I was like, yeah, this is not for me. And so I traveled, and I went and did I had been surf coaching already, and I went and did my personal training stuff. So I kind of armed myself with the things that would be useful whilst I was traveling. And then I fell into running surf schools for about 5 years and just loved every second of it, mainly because, you're spending all day in the ocean, and it's a really seasonal gig here because it's cold in the winter. And so every winter I would just travel. So I would work, 7 or 8 months of the year and then travel the rest of the year. And then fell into, from that, yes, this is the squiggly part. I'm going to go through it really fast because you don't need to hear my life story, but surf school, and then started running events. Totally kind of random. Like a really good friend of mine in Australia is a freestyle motocross rider. And I was in Oz, like in down season. And I went to one of his shows and I was like, this is like one of the best things I've ever seen. And I was like, we should run a show back home. And so he came over the following summer. So started running like surf, skate, BMX, freestyle motocross shows. And I was always running them for like nonprofits like Surf Aid International and that kind of stuff. So it was always in that line. And then I got offered a job working for the government, for the environment department. And at that time, I really thought, I was like, this is it. I can save the planet. I'm going to work for the environment department. And it was, on paper, it was an amazing gig. It was like education and awareness officer. And I don't know if it's the same like in the US, but here, if you get a government job, you're kind of set for life.
Yeah.
If you want to
Yeah.
be,
That's
you're in, there's a track, you're like your pay is going to go up every year, like all of that stuff. So I feel like my family and everyone was like, amazing, finally. And but what I realized was that there was no room for creativity whatsoever. And there was just so much red tape, and there were like meetings for the sake of meetings. And I'm like, I'm not really having an impact in this as much as I thought I was. And so like classic Lindsay, I have like all these other random ideas going on in my head at the same time. And I to this day, I can't even remember what sparked it. But at the time, my dad was listening to this amazing Australian artist called Xavier Rudd, whose music is amazing. And I decided to email his manager and say that I wanted to run a gig. I had never run a gig before. Like I brought DJs and bands in when I was running events, but I'd never done any like music promotion or whatever. But I was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna see. And this guy came back to me and was like, oh, what's your offer for us? And I had no idea. So I was like, 15 grand. And then he was like, okay, we'll come and do a show. And I was like, oh shit, now I need to find 15 grand. And so, so funny when I think about it now. So I remember going to my parents for dinner and I was like, hey dad, you know, you've been listening to Xavier Rudd? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, he's playing a gig here this summer. And my dad was like, what? That's amazing. I was like, I'm running it. And you could see my whole family are like, oh, what have you done? And so that was the start of running music festivals.
I'm running it and I need 15 grand.
I don't need 15 grand. I did not ask my dad for the 15 grand. I managed to hustle the 15 grand.
That's great.
So yeah, I ran music festivals for almost 5 years. And then, and same thing, almost like using music festivals as a way to educate people on sustainability. So it's like finding sneaky ways to get sustainability in. And then, very long story short, but that, as many people who work in the live events space know, especially music industry,
Sure.
We did that classic startup thing where we grew like too big too soon and got like a bunch of VC money. And yeah, basically we started building a second event, and then a few things went wrong with the second event, and we ended up having to cancel the show, and canceling that show knocked everything out. So we lost the French show, then we ended up losing the one here, lost the business, and then it just was like dominoes, lost everything. Sure. So and then, you know, eventually lost work, lost money, lost house, lost husband, like everything. Moved back to Australia, and full circle went back to surf coaching. I was like, this is a thing that just, I know, guarantee, like brings me joy. And so just got back in the ocean and realized that I'd forgotten how important that was to me. And so, and then from there, just I trained as a coach in Sydney, and was coaching for maybe 2 or 3 years. And it just segued really naturally back towards like branding and marketing and comms, because that's kind of what my role was within the festivals. But this time around, it was like, this has to have an impact. Like, I really want to do this in a space where I feel like I'm making a difference. And so it just felt so natural to go back to ocean. And then over the last few years, that has kind of grown and grown. And there's a whole bunch of projects that I work on now. But my kind of main gig is Protect Blue, which is a creative agency. So myself and my business partner, so my role is strategy, and he's storytelling. So when you kind of blend those things together and you get in a very, very narrow lane of ocean conservation, it's been kind of remarkable. And we just get to work on some super, super interesting projects.
I think it's so important to kind of go back a little bit and highlight the idea that you had the job, right? You had the job at the big, you know, you were doing the thing and you checked all the boxes. I'd say you were no longer the talk at Thanksgiving, but I don't think you guys have Thanksgiving. So, so you're like, you know, it's just, the light is now in your own way is like, okay, I'm here, right? But it didn't feel authentic, right? It didn't resonate with who and what you were as a person. And then to kind of go through all of that, right? And then also have those experiences where you feel like, all right, here, I'm arrived, I'm doing the thing. And then to kind of go back to the essence of who you were, because surfing obviously is a big part of your life, right? The ocean is a big part of, you're like a British Moana. It's a huge part of your life where you reconnected to something that is more than just what others, outsiders might look at, just like the ocean, right? It resonates with you.
I mean, it's like, okay, so a random story for you. When my marriage was falling apart, my husband went on a surf trip to Indonesia, and I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, this could save us, like, because I knew the power of surfing, and I was like, we'd gone through this really hard time together. So he went to Indo to surf with the boys. I was like, brilliant. And when he came back, I was like, okay, I think we might make it. And he came back and he was like, I've decided we can't be married anymore. And I was like, oh, okay, that didn't go how I thought it would. And I was beyond devastated. And it just was like, you're in that state of just shock, right? Like, you're not even processing it. And within a week he'd left. And the day after he left, I don't even know what caused me to do it, but I was like, I just need to go surfing, and I'm going to go surfing for 100 days in a row. And I just made a promise to myself, like, what if you just surfed every day for 100 days? Like, all I knew in that moment in time was that my world had like fallen apart. I'd lost everything that I knew to be true or solid or anything. And all I had left was like, I just need to get in the sea. And so I put a GoPro on my camera, on my surfboard. And I did that mainly for accountability, right? Because I was like, I'm going to tell a few people that I'm doing it. And then I'll post a video every day of like the surf. And that 100 days, you know, it's not like a Disney movie, and I wasn't like suddenly really happy and everything was sorted by the end of it.
So you're not Moana.
No,
Okay.
but I wish I was. But that 100 days was the most healing thing I have ever done in my life. Like I think it saved my life, honestly. And what it reminded me of who I am, and it reminded me of what was important. And it just, you know, there were some days where that was literally all I managed to do was like get out of bed, go to work, and just get a surf in, you know. And now I look back, and it was like this period of time that was just reconnecting me to this thing that for me is like, it's like the equivalent of church, right? It's like that's
Sure.
where I go, you know. So and then ever since then it almost like it felt like it was a course correct. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I've never lost that connection since. And I had lost it purely because of life had gotten in the way, and it was really stressful, and there was a whole bunch of stuff going down, and work at that time, you know, running festivals is full on, and it's so easy to sometimes let those things go that you don't realize how vital they are until they're gone, you know?
Yeah, and I think going back to what you know and what in so many ways serves you, right? It's I've been surfing once. I went surfing, and three things stand out for me. Two terrible, one beyond beautiful.
Yeah.
And one was wiping out and the board literally almost just grazing my butt, just to be brutally honest, just graze. I was like, whoa, that was way too close. After that, crawling to the beach and just throwing up water, just completely. I had a board that was not meant for a beginner. I went with a buddy of mine who like surfs, and he had like a sport board. And he's like, here, try this. I was like, this is not going to work. But one thing that stands out to me from that experience was when I was paddling out and breaking dawn and watching the sun come up. And it was this moment in like, it will forever be in my mind. It's snapshotted. It's one of those moments that on my deathbed will play over in my mind. And it was this moment of just, there was there was nothing. Like he was off in the distance, and it was just me and like the abyss. Like it was just it was like being in outer space and watching the sun come up. And I was just like, it was so surreal. And I think it's so important to stay connected to things that humble you. And that could be anything: surfing, jujitsu, you know, public speaking, whatever it is, something that keeps you grounded in who and what you are, but also creates like this flow, right? Like you said, like it's just something that's in you. That flow state is something that, I mean, I talk about it a lot on the podcast. It's just something to me that's just like, you can't even put a value on that.
You can't. And also, like, I think on that humility piece, it's like, I look at it also from a sustainability point of view, right? Like being connected to nature and remembering how small we are and how like inconsequential we are. And having those moments of like proper awe and wonder, you know, where you're like, you know, nature just takes your breath away. Like it's so incredible. And you know, there are definitely moments, and it's hilarious. Like right now, surfing over here in the winter is anything but glamorous, right? Like it's freezing. So I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but like our water temperature at the moment is probably around 8 degrees Celsius. So you're wearing like a 5 mil suit, you're wearing boots, gloves, hood, like the whole setup, you know. But this weekend just gone, you know, we had like a morning with no wind, and it's like you paddle out and you're like, you're having this experience, and it's so incredibly beautiful. And you are, like you said, so often when you're in the surf, you're on your own, or you have these moments of complete peace, and it's just, yeah, it's super powerful.
Yeah, I think connecting or reconnecting with nature is something that we've gotten away from as a culture, like definitely on this side of things. And some of my favorite moments of doing the podcast or doing it at night is when I walk out of the pod shed and I walk out and I look up, and granted, I'm 10 minutes outside of Manhattan, so I still have a lot of light pollution, but I look up, and if it's a clear night, like it's just that reminder of how small you are in the grand scheme of things. And you're just this blade of grass that's completely insignificant, but yet still part of the bigger picture.
There's one of my favorite, I love Calvin and Hobbes, and one of my favorite cartoons from Calvin and Hobbes is that, because they're always looking at the stars, they're looking up at the stars, and I think Calvin is saying to Hobbes, he's like, imagine if everyone spent more time looking at the stars, like we'd all be really different people. And I'm like, it's so true, you know, like just taking those little pauses. And I do the same, like, because I'm in this tiny house and I'm super lucky, like really no light pollution here. Like just remembering every now and then to like switch off, you know, your computer or your TV or whatever, and just go stand outside for like 5 minutes and just look up, you know. It's pretty amazing, and it's accessible to everyone, you know.
Right. That's not, you don't need to be in a certain pay bracket or class of person. It is something that, you know, anybody can do that. And silence for me, like, you know, meditating or sensory deprivation tanks, those have been like probably the most serving thing. And it's important to tap into those experiences in order to kind of get perspective. And also, I think ultimately find your purpose in things.
Yeah, totally. And I think the more you learn, there's a coach whose work I used to love, and she I haven't read her stuff in ages, but she talked about this concept of super conditions, right? Which is like that we all have a set of conditions under which we thrive, and they're different for all of us. But I think so many people fall into like these default conditions, which is like, oh, I'm going to work from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m, or I'm going to sit at a desk all day, or I'm going to eat my lunch at this time. But like, you didn't make any of those conditions. Society just kind of put them on you and you accepted them. And I think when you become a little bit more curious and intentional about figuring out what your super conditions are, like it's magic, you know. And it's one of the things that I do now, you know, if we collaborate like with another team on a big project, like I'm like the goofball where I'm like, I need to know everyone's super conditions.
What are your super conditions? Break them down for me.
Yeah, and it's so funny because people kind of laugh at me, but then we do it and I'm like, no, like so for example, one of my super conditions is like when I'm overwhelmed or like super stressed out, like the best thing for someone to do is like take me outside. Like we should take Linzi for a walk now because she's melting, like her brain is melting. And it sounds so silly, but it's like, it's useful for people who work with me to know that, because it, like other people, it would be like, just give them some quiet time, or like they want to talk it through. So it almost reminds me of like the whole love language thing,
Sure.
but it's a little bit broader than that. And I find it really, really good when you're working in teams, is like, yeah, figure those things out. Like, what do we need to do? What can we do for each other so we understand, you know, how to help each other thrive, you know?
But those the weird thing is those super conditions and the conditions that we put ourselves in, right? Whether it be societally or whatever the case may be, we find ourselves in them. And then to your point, once you become curious, and that's a perfect way to put it, once you become curious to yourself and your place in things, it can be very shattering as well, right? To recognize that you are under conditions that you're like, wait a minute, I didn't agree to have lunch at this time every day or work this job every day. Like and all of a sudden you're looking around and your reality can just completely crumble before you.
Totally. And I feel like I'm really lucky because apart from that one gig with the government, I've never had like a normal job. So I've never really been someone who's had conditions placed on me, you know, and you know, I think maybe sometimes it's good to have them so you can figure stuff out. But one of the interesting things that I see quite often with people who are transitioning from, let's say they were working in corporate and now they're, you know, venturing and doing something on their own, is they either bring the old conditions with them.
Yeah.
Just because they're so ingrained and they almost don't know what to do without them, or they try and operate with no rules and no structure whatsoever because they're like, oh my God, I'm free. Which also doesn't work, you know?
No.
You see it when people, I have a few friends who've transitioned out of like regular jobs to working for themselves. And they're so excited at not having any rules that they just like go on a free for all. And then normally within like 6 months, they're like, oh, this is not working at all. You know, I'm like, yeah, you have to make some rules for yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
good rules. And to me, that's your super conditions.
Well, it's the same thing as like where people are right now, where so many people are working from home and the comfort and convenience is like, yeah, I'll leave on my sweatpants and not take a shower for 3 days. Like, yeah, that's great. But it's like also not very healthy to put yourself like in a working atmosphere when you haven't showered for 3 days and you're still in your pajamas. Like there's something to, and it's to your point, there's something to waking up, taking a shower, getting prepared, like getting dressed and showing up, even though you're not leaving your house, showing up. It just changes the way your brain is working.
I feel like I mean, we've been really lucky in Jersey, like with COVID, in so much as we only had one proper lockdown. And I think it was like March, April time. And I actually found it, I mean, for one, like you have to kind of, what's the word? You have to like acknowledge your privilege in those situations. Cause it's like, I run my own business, so I could work from home. I have a place to live. I have food so there's that piece. But like beyond that, like I actually found it really fascinating because it felt like such a groundhog day, but I was like, isn't this cool? Like every day I get to experiment and tweak these super conditions a little bit to try and get to like the optimum day, And so I was like, okay, so let's test out. So each day I would be trying something different. I'd be like, okay, well, normally I get up and I run, and like, what if I ran earlier? What if I ran later? What if I ran a different route? What if I ran listening to this music instead of that music? Like just everything tweaking a little bit down to like, so I intermittent fast. So it was like, what if I change my window of like fasting? And it was, for me, it was like a really playful way to be in lockdown, that every day you were like testing stuff. And by the end of it, it's like, I've gotten pretty close to like the perfect working day, because you'd been able to monitor, because nothing else was changing, right? Like everything else was the same. And yeah, I find it really interesting.
Yeah, there was a great study that was done on people's taste in music changing over the duration of like a buddy of mine. I had him on the podcast. He's an author and he's a fireman in New York. And he's like, I just started listening to opera music. I'm like, it wasn't happening to me. And then I realized it did because I started listening to 1970s Japanese jazz music. And don't ask.
That was a genre.
Right, exactly. But I was like, oh wait, I'm like totally into this. So I guess it was happening. I just didn't recognize it. But there is something there where you're able to tinker and tamper with, because you don't have all this outside noise going on.
Yeah.
And what better way to learn more about yourself and what kind of puts you in, whether the optimal day or optimal state, optimal mind, optimal frequency, than toying around and seeking a little bit of novelty.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I also think about it, because I find it really fascinating to see how other people are coping with lockdown and where they're at. And like I said, like you have to acknowledge your privilege and know that, you can only really play with these things if your basics are good.
Sure. Yeah. You need your hierarchy of needs need to be met, right? Like
right.
The novelty of this is purely that.
Yeah. But one of the things it made me think of, and this sounds hilarious because I have not been to jail, but it makes me think of like, I feel like there are two groups of people. There are the people that if they go to jail, they would probably end up miserable, kind of the people that go and just give up and become the victim and just have like really struggle with that situation. And then you hear these stories of people who go to jail and end up like becoming a lawyer or like
right.
and like reading every freaking book in the library, or like becoming super fit, or like becoming an activist or whatever. And it's like, I almost looked at lockdown a little bit like that. Like, are you going to use this time? Because you could really use it,
Sure.
And yeah, I don't know. It's always been something that's curious to me, like people's mindsets with this sort of thing.
Yeah, there was a meme that said, if after quarantine you're still in the same place you were in the beginning, then time was never your issue. And for some reason that stuck with me big time, because my big issue was always time. It was always time. And then it was, okay, like I saw that midway through. I was like, oh, that's amazing, because you can't use time as the excuse anymore. We try to find these things to blame, to deflect off of our own, whether it be laziness or just our own mindset. And when you're kind of faced with yourself in those situations, how are you going to persevere? Are things happening to you, or are things happening for you?
Yeah, it's so like, and it's so inspiring to see, obviously there's been so much bad that's come out of this, but also like there's been a lot of good, you know, there's been a lot of like, one of the things I've really noticed in terms of business from the business side is like, we had a conversation about this the other day of like how useful constraints are when it comes to creativity. You know, sometimes we imagine creativity needs like wide open spaces and blank canvases, but actually creativity is amazing when it has a few edges. And we had a project just recently, like we've only just finished it, where it basically turned into a sprint. It was like a gig for the government. It was like this super interesting around climate change communications. And we basically got this funding and they were like, we'll give you the funding if you can deliver this job in 3 weeks. And we were like, oh my God, this is insane. Like, this is insane. But we did it, and it forced us to work at such a pace, and it forced us to really work on that minimum viable product concept, right? Because there wasn't space to like do this big exploration or ideation phase. It was like, we just have to build something. And we got to the end of it and we were like, who knew that we could build something so epic in such a short period of time, you know? And I think, yeah, for me, I look at that and try and remember that, because it's the, you know, sometimes we look at the barriers or the challenges when it comes to creativity and we're like, oh, I wish we had more money, or I wish we had more time. But, you know, when I think back to festival days, we won a whole bunch of awards. And I feel like every award that we won was almost partly because we had no money for any of our marketing or our comms. And so we end up being super, super creative with everything we did. And I think it forces you to work in different ways, you know?
Yeah, when you get painted, you know, into a corner, you have to figure out a way, whatever it is, right? That's like kind of similar to like, again, being humbled, and whether it be surfing, or in my case, it's like jujitsu to some extent. It's like when you're in a situation, you could either choose to panic, right? But that's not going to serve you ultimately. Like that panic, that panic-stricken mindset, and being a cat in a bag when someone's in a and you're in a bad position, someone's mount or your whatever it is, or you could take a deep breath and be like, okay, I'm here. I've been here before. What can I implement? What have I learned? What tools can I implement and roll out to get myself out of this situation and put myself in a better situation?
Totally. One of my really good friends is a big wave surfer. So he's a he's a maniac, right? Like he surfs really, really big waves. And I always remember, so to give you a sense of how much of a maniac he is, he paddleboarded solo, unassisted, from Morocco to the Caribbean. So he was at sea for 93 days on his own. He's
Wait,
yeah.
Rewind that real quick. How did he like sustain life? How did he not like?
So his paddle board was like this craft that was built specially for it, so he could sleep in it. I mean, yeah, it's so funny because when you know him, you're like, oh yeah, Chris would, yeah, he'll do that. But like, I feel like everyone else was like, what? This guy's just gonna die. Like he's gonna die.
It's a death sentence.
It's a death sentence. And you know, you like, people row across the Atlantic all the time and stuff, but normally they'll have a support boat, or if they do it unassisted, like they're in a crew, they're not on their own, you know?
Right.
And yeah, he was, it was totally nuts. Talk about having surreal conversations about the stars. He had a sat phone with him, so I had a few phone calls whilst he was at sea doing it, which was insane, and we had lots of good conversation about the stars. But anyway, he gave me some advice once that I will never forget. And I don't know whether your surfing experience, you had this or not, but quite often in the surf, when a big set is coming in, so when like big waves are rolling in, what happens is like there's like an energetic shift in the crowd. If you're in a crowd of people, everyone's like, oh shit, you know, like, and everyone is trying to paddle towards the horizon. Like it's like you're kind of scratching to get over every wave so you don't get caught under them. And I had this conversation with him once. I've had some really interesting conversations with him about fear, because he's seemingly somewhat fearless, right?
Sure.
And he was like, okay, so when a big set is coming in, here's what I want you to do. I actually want you to slow everything down. He's like, I know that everyone else is racing to the horizon. He's like, but think about it. Think what you need your body to do, and what you need your body to be ready to like be prepared for. Slow it all down. He's like, I want you to be really conscious about your breathing, about your mindset, And next time you're in the surf and it's big and you can feel that like panic coming in and the desperation to like paddle as fast as you can, he's like, I want you to purposely slow the whole thing down. And it's been really interesting because I've done it a few times since, and it's completely changed my state. But also I start to see it in other surfers where you can spot the person who is also doing that, who is not joining the rest of the crowd in like panic mode, but has slowed it down and is just changing their mindset and their approach. And there's so much to that, because I think we fall into these states of panic and like fight or flight, and in those situations where, you know, it obviously depends how big the surf is, but like you might be in some form of danger, but understanding the value of slowing it down and getting, like you're saying, into that flow state is remarkable, you know?
Yeah, because there's a moment in there where you have this what feels like a split second to respond, react, right? And it's in our nature, it's in our DNA to react, right? It's in our nature to panic, to
Yeah.
right? Your body's telling you something. There's information in that response, right? But taking that information and now using it to your advantage, and the only way you can access that is by slowing things down and by being able to kind of, okay, like my body's telling me something here. What is it telling me? And now how can I use that information to my benefit, or to get out of this danger, or, you know, assess it accordingly?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when I was going through all the festival shit, and at that time I was having really bad panic attacks, and I'd never experienced anything like that before. And so the first time I had a panic attack, it was so severe. I was living in France, and I went to the doctors, and I was like, I thought I was having a heart attack. Like, I no joke was like, this is full on. And then amazing French doctor, where she was like, you just need to spend some more time outside and sleep more. I was like, oh wow, brilliant. Like, thank goodness for doctors like that, right? Rather than giving you pills. But it was really interesting because one of the techniques that she gave me was this just very, very simple, like using your 5 senses. She's like,
Sure.
When you feel it coming on, like, this is what you need to do. And I'm like, I feel super lucky that, you know, I think sometimes we go through these periods of time in life that are pretty dark, and I almost would never take it back because it taught me so much. But I haven't had a panic attack for years, but I've held on to that little tool, and I try and use it just when I'm feeling like heightened, you know, whether it's stressed out or just really busy or whatever, and just like slow everything down. So it's the same as that whole, you know, approach in the surf, but it's just like day to day. And sometimes I try and do it, and it sounds really goofy, but it's like sometimes I just try and have like a slow hour, you know, and be like, what if you just did everything slowly? And I don't mean like speed slow. I mean I mean more just like really intentionally. And I remember like forever ago, probably I was like 18, I had this boyfriend who was training to be a carpenter, and I always remember his boss said to him this like expression, like 2 hands on the job. He was like, always 2 hands on the job. And I always thought it was really interesting because he was basically like, you have to be paying attention to what you're doing, you know? And I think it's the same here. Like, we're so often trying to multitask, or like we're watching a show, but then we're texting someone at the same time, or we're so rarely focusing on just one thing, that actually to do that it's actually pretty, it's pretty crazy. It feels pretty good to just bring things right back down, you know?
Yeah, well, it's about being mindful in the monotony, right? Because we're in, whether it be a cup of coffee or the shower, brushing your teeth, there's always opportunity to be as mindful, as present as you can be. But we take these small things that we do for granted, and we're, like you said, we're just on the next thing. We're always constantly on the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I feel like I'm someone who really appreciates, I really value efficiency.
Yeah.
And I've grown up like that, right? But sometimes it really works against me, because it's like, what if you didn't listen to a podcast? I feel bad saying that because we're on a podcast.
That's okay.
But what if you didn't listen to a podcast every single time you were driving? Like, what if sometimes you just drove? Do you know what I mean? And you just,
Yeah.
and but it's so crazy how we've come to like fill our brains, with all this stuff all the time, that we don't give ourselves permission to just wash the dishes. Like, don't watch TV and wash the dishes, just wash the dishes, because actually some really good ideas might show up, or you might be thinking about something that you hadn't allowed yourself to think about.
Yeah, that's something that I get, whether it be in meditation, or I'm a huge proponent of the sensory deprivation tank, and really ridding yourself of all the external distractions. And you're talking to a person who I love podcasting. Obviously, I listen to a ton of podcasts, but I literally had to unsubscribe to every podcast because it was giving me almost anxiety. And I
Yeah.
hate using that word because I think it's overused nowadays and people default to it. But it was giving me, I felt pressure to listen to different where I literally had to unsubscribe to everything. Like, if I come across one that serves me and I want to listen to it, that's what I'll do. But I was literally like, I was like, oh, this one. And Joe Rogan's 3.5 hours. So like,
I know.
and I had no commute to work. So I was like, where am I like, I don't have 3.5 hours.
Where did 3.5 hours come from?
Like,
Right.
like how am I going to do this? I can't magically create 3.5 hours. So I had to, and then I was like, I pick and choose which ones, and if they align with what I need, then they will. And I try not to put too much weight in that. But to your point, like, it could be anything, right? It can be just sitting and washing the dishes and not listening to anything. But so many people, I think where it is the fear of that, right? Because the thought, what's going to come up? What am I going to be thinking? So I rather mute that voice in my mind and distract it by Wheel of Fortune on the background than actually being present.
Yeah, totally. And I'm guilty of it, and I sometimes have, it's really interesting. It's one thing that I've missed a lot in lockdown, or even just in this last year, because our gyms have been closed for most of the year, right? And so going to a yoga class for me was like this really, like, it was forced like timeout, right? Because you weren't doing yoga at home where, so, you could get up halfway through and go do something, or you're like, oh shit, I'm gonna write that down before I forget, whatever. It was like, there was this hour and a half where you're like, right, I'm just gonna do this. And so it's been really interesting to try and carve out those times. And that mindfulness piece, I think so many people are really scared of it. Like, what will happen if I just am quiet? Like, what demons might show up? What voices am I like trying to push to one side? And yeah, there's this concept. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Have you heard of sit spots before?
Sit spots?
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. So sit spots, like, they really came from like ecology, really. Like, there were people working in ecology and like wildlife conservation and nature conservation, and it's this idea of it's almost like it is like a meditation, really, but it's outdoors, and your eyes are open, and the idea is that you go to the same spot. So you find a spot in nature, and so it could just be in your backyard. It doesn't need to be like wild or anything. And the idea is you go and you sit, and preferably for like 15 minutes, and you just sit quietly with your eyes open, observing with all your senses nature. And if you sit quietly and still enough, nature starts to interact with you. And the idea is that you keep going back to the same spot, and it's like it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the call around seasons, right? So you notice how this space changes through the seasons, and the different creatures that you see, whether it's like ants in the grass or whatever. But for me, sit spots are so magical. Like, that's my favorite type of meditation, is to go do a sit spot, because it's weird, because it's not sensory deprivation. It's kind of the opposite, but it's just nature that's flooding in. There's no noise other than nature, and it's super powerful. And I've led retreats and workshops where we've done sit spots, and for some people, the idea of sitting still for 15 minutes in nature is terrifying.
Horrifying
Yeah.
for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for me, and I could resonate with that first, that you have to, step into that space. Cause for me, the reason I didn't float for so long was because, and this was the turning point, I thought to myself, I'm afraid of what I'm going to actually think. And then I had the reality of saying, well, that's scarier than anything I'm actually going to think. So in that moment, I picked up the phone and made it a hard appointment. And I was like, I'll be there, because I was like, well, if I'm afraid of what I'm going to think, that's horrifying. And so many people, and it's to the point of, I think people try to avoid that discomfort, and that fear can drive you, either you can go towards it and step into it and be like, okay, we're going to go into the cave now, and we're going to come up with some shit, and to sit in silence and darkness for an hour and a half. There's a lot that does kind of come to the surface, but unless you quiet your mind and allow the subconscious to become conscious, you're always going to be dancing with that devil.
So tell me this, I'm so curious about these tanks, because when I was living in Australia, it was the first time I heard about them. This is years ago. And I was like, this sounds like bliss, right? And then I found out that they like close the lid on you. Is that right?
So there's different types of tanks.
Okay.
The float center that I work with and that I go to there's open room tanks. So it's basically a large bathtub in a dark room, all private. There's one that has saloon style doors, so like they're frosted glass saloon style doors. Yeah. And then there is the traditional pod that you can close and you feel like you're in.
I feel like the Linzi'z is like next level for me. That's what put me off, because I was like, oh damn, I'm all over this, and I went and I saw them with the lid, and I was like, oh, I'm not sure how I feel about that. So I didn't go. And now I'm like, I'd love to go to one that like doesn't, I think it would be amazing, but we don't have one here in Jersey, but I would love to go to one, so long as they don't close a lid on me.
You could leave the lid open, and you can leave lights on. Some places play music. So there's, again, depending on the system that they have in place. Right. But yeah, I mean, for your first experience, that's probably a tough one. But at the same time, it's so dark, and I mean, you literally there's nothing darker, right? That you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference if the lid was closed or open.
Okay. Like it's so funny, because everything else about it completely appeals to me. I'm like, floating, water, darkness, no noise, amazing. It was just the lid that I was like, I don't know if I can do it.
It is definitely a very different experience. I've been doing it for a long time now, and I absolutely love it. It's like my one thing. I'm like, all right, that's when I need to reset things or get clear on certain things. It's my go-to for sure.
Wow, that's super cool. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna put it back on my list.
Put it back on your list. How did you get connected with Journey? Because that's obviously you facilitate a class in Journey coaching, which I have my certification through. How did you get connected with them?
So I connected with John. This is when I was living in Australia. I don't even remember how we ended up connecting, but I had a call with him because my life was falling apart. And like my life was falling apart. So I had a call with him like as a client, and then we just stayed in touch, and we just stayed in touch. And then I think, I don't even remember how it happened. Like he was starting to build Journey. So it wasn't even called Journey then. I think it was just called Catalyst. I think it was called the Catalyst coaching program. And he reached out and was like, hey, would you be interested in teaching these classes? And for me, it was super interesting because I had done my coach training in Sydney. It was in person. It was nowhere near as good as Journey, I can tell you that much for sure. But the classes that were missing, like they taught everyone how to be really good coaches, but they kind of left you and they were like, now go.
Right.
And it was like, so mine was like an in-person training, and I think there were like 60 people in my cohort, and within not even a year, within 6 months, I think there were probably only 10 of us at max who were making money and who are actually running coaching businesses. And it had nothing to do with the quality of coaching and everything to do with like your marketing and branding skills, and business skills. And so when I was talking to John, I was like, yeah, these are the classes that people really need. And so we started designing them. And then over the last few years, I've done a decent amount of work in LA. There's a lot of ocean conservation folk there. So there's been a few times where we caught up in person. But yeah, it just kind of happened through that. And it's hilarious because it was one of those friendships where I think I had been teaching that class and we'd been, talking and whatever for years before we actually met. And we like ended up going for breakfast. So we're like, oh, wow, this is, those weird friendships that you have now. But yeah.
Yeah, you taught the branding element, branding strategy, and obviously having the experience that you have. It was one of those classes that I walked in, I was like, oh, I needed that. Like, it's exactly to your point. Like, it was one of those like, oh yeah, like this, you could teach the best coaching practices, you can implement them to the best of your ability, but unless you actually have a game plan on how to approach the marketing, the branding, who and what you are, and get your message across, it kind of all does fall by the wayside.
Yeah, and I think that the coaching industry is somewhat guilty. I'm going to expand it and say wellness. It's not just coaching, but like somewhat guilty of like a lot of fluff and a lot of like cookie cutter coaches. There are a lot of coaches who sound the same, you know what I mean? And it's one of the things that I always feel kind of bad in my class that I call it out, because I know that I'm without a doubt offending someone in the class when I say it, which is like please don't build a coaching website that says I can help you live the life of your dreams, because like it's just, no one's googling that. Like no one's looking for that, you know. It's such
I'll take that off my website now.
But it's like, it's such fluff, and there are so many coaches who have the same language, and I'm like, no, you stand for something bigger than that. Like you just need to find it and then communicate it and articulate it in a really clear way for people to understand. But I just think so many people fall into that trap of sounding the same and looking the same. And ultimately it doesn't work, you know, because it's not what lands. Like to me, whether it's a brand or a campaign or a service provider, like the people whose communications really land with me are the ones that are like, they stand for something and they're really clear, you know? So it's just helping people get to that phase, I think.
Yeah, it's an authenticity thing too, right? And it's like for me, and fully transparent, I don't like the moniker life coach. I don't feel comfortable living at, like people, some people have said to me, no, you need to own it. I'm like, and I understand that, right? It labels what it is, and that's kind of why the Boba Fett helmet's there. Like I prefer the idea of journeyman for hire. Like that's what I fall under. Like that's my thing, right? Like it's I'm not going to tell you how to live life. Who knows how to live life? Like nobody knows how to live life. We're like, let's call it for what it is. And I think
yeah. I mean, I dropped the name, the like name coach within like 18 months of coaching. I was like, I don't want to be categorized as a coach. It just didn't feel right for me.
Yeah. Again, like it makes sense that you label it a coach, right? Like I get that, but at the same time, to me, it just doesn't feel authentic. Like it's just like, I'm not, it's too highfalutin, I guess. I don't know. It's too like, oh, I'm a life coach, I'm going to tell you how to live life. It's like, fuck you, man. No way.
Yeah, totally. And it's really interesting because I think even what you choose to call yourself will end up attracting the right or the wrong people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you something. Have you ever seen the documentary, My Octopus Teacher?
Oh, yes. Yeah, of course I have.
I figured you did, but I didn't want to just make an assumption. I didn't want to just make an assumption. I watched, oddly enough, not too much longer before I saw that documentary. I went out for dinner with my wife and I had an amazing piece of octopus. Long story short, after I ate it, for whatever reason, I walked out of the bathroom. I not to be gross, but I picked a piece out of my tooth, and I walked out. And I looked at my wife. I was like, I'm never eating octopus again. I'm never eating. Like something just happened to me, and I was like, not. And then I watched that documentary. I was like, oh,
right.
The future version of me knew that I was going to watch this documentary and I was going to be completely in love with an octopus.
Right. It's an incredible documentary, right?
Unbelievable. What is it about the ocean to you that there's that connection? Because like we're watching that documentary, he goes out to the ocean. For those who haven't seen it, he goes out to the ocean every day, right? Kind of like what you did for surfing, right? Every day.
Yeah.
And he creates this relationship with this octopus, and he realizes this is a sentient, conscious being. It's not just, mindlessly pecking at seeds like a chicken, right? No disrespect to chicken, but this is something that has an awareness about it and is playful and intentional. And he gets this connection not only to the octopus, but to the ocean around him. What is it for you that connection is?
Oh man, that's like the $1 million question.
I'm glad I asked it.
I don't know if I have a good answer for her though. Like, it's weird for me to say it because I've been so lucky to have grown up by the ocean, and so it's always been like my playground. I think it comes back to that humility piece, right? It's like I feel most at home in the ocean. It reminds me who I am. It reminds me of how small I am in like the best of ways. Do you know what I mean? Like the best of ways. And it's also this sense that so it's really funny. I had a conversation with a friend about this a while back. Like, it's the thing I trust in the most, right? So I'm not a religious person at all, right? I grew up in a very non-religious family. And so for me, trust in nature is like, that's the most solid thing I have, like, I know that the sun will come up every day and it will go down every day. I know the tide will come in and the tide will go out. And there's some sense of like security and just like groundedness in that, and it doesn't matter where I am in the world. As soon as I go in the ocean, I'm like, I'm good again, I'm home, and I think for everyone it's different. I mean, I know it's really interesting. I connected this last year with a friend of a friend who's a mindfulness teacher, and she's all mountains. Like, so her equivalent is spending time in the mountains, and I love spending time in the mountains, but I don't get the same feeling, right? And I think it's just because of the amount of time I've spent in the sea or whatever. But there's just something to it. And I think once you've spent a good chunk of your life in the ocean, it's a relationship that you never want to give up. And I think especially if you're, the ocean has at times in your life been, it's almost like it's been the place where I've had my best memories ever. Like, the best times of my life have been in the ocean, but also during the darkest periods of my life, that's where I've gone to find sanctuary. And so if you think about it, anything that was that for you would be special and you'd have a huge connection with. Some people would say the same thing about church or about a particular person or a particular place. And for me, that just happens to be the ocean,
Yeah, well, I think there is a spiritual and religious, we call it religious element to any of these things that we lean into, right? And I think, being nature, right? Like, let's reverse it, right? Being nature, being like how much more connected to God, and I'm using God as just the term, how much more connected to God can you get? And you can go into church all you want and pray and receive every Eucharist and baptism and christening, and it doesn't mean that you're connected to God. You can go check all the boxes. It doesn't mean you're necessarily connected, but how much more connected to God, or whatever you want to label it, can you get than being out in nature? And it's odd that you find the ocean as you trust it, right? Then that's a relationship that you need to establish, because the ocean, from my surfing experience, just knocked the shit out of me.
Right. Oh, it knocks the shit out of me all the time. But I still trust it. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, like, that 100 days of surfing for me was a reminder of all of those things, right? And now, like, I think part of the reason why so much of the work we do, like, it feels so important to reconnect people to nature, because I think there's a book that I recommend to everyone, but I have to give you like a disclaimer because it's a full-on book to read. It's the book that I read with like a pencil, and I have to like write notes, and I can only read like a few pages at a time. There's a guy called Charles Eisenstein. Incredible guy, and he wrote a book called Climate: A New Story, and a lot of this book is about this, what he calls the myth of separation, which is like the separation between humans and nature, and how we've forgotten our interconnectedness, and basically saying that is at the root of almost every problem we have in the world right now, as we've forgotten that we are part of this bigger ecosystem. And to me, spending time in nature is your constant reminder of that connection, and we, there's a lot that we do in our work where we're trying to remind people, like, hey, what you do to the planet, you do to yourself, or what you do to the ocean, you're doing to yourself, and because this separation has been so big for so long, it's almost like we've completely forgotten that we're part of the same system, and I find that I find it hugely comforting, but also I can see that it's the source of so many of our issues right now.
Yeah, it's operating on the micro that represents the macro, right? And I think that's, to your point, that's where people get lost in it, because it's like, well, if I use a plastic straw, what's the difference? What's one plastic straw gonna do? If I don't, and like every time I have a little 6 pack of seltzer, I cut the little things. I have my metal straws, and yeah, in the
Yeah.
grand scheme of things, like, right, if we all operate on the micro of that, we're like, I don't make a big difference. Then if everyone thought that way, then no difference is made. But if you can operate in the micro, we're like, yeah, I do make a difference, then it does have a bigger impact.
Yeah, there's a guy called Buckminster Fuller. Have you ever heard of Bucky Fuller?
I have not.
Oh my God, amazing. So
Drop me some Buckney Fuller
yeah,
information.
yeah, he's amazing. He's amazing. Anyway, he is no longer alive, but he was this incredible guy. And like I can't even go into like all the different things he did, but anyway, he was an architect and a systems designer and stuff, but he talked a lot about this concept of spaceship Earth. And it's
Oh
beautiful.
yeah. Let's go. Go ahead.
Yeah. So like the idea that everyone is a passenger on spaceship Earth, right? And so we all have a role to play on this spaceship, because you can't just be sitting back doing nothing. Like we all have a role, and like, so what's the role that you're going to play? And I really, like, for me, everything that I do kind of comes back down to that. And when I think about, when I teach branding, you would remember this, like my big thing is like, what's your why? Like, what's your purpose? And for me, my purpose is about making a dent in something. And I almost like, when I work with people, I'm like, I don't care whether your cause is gender equality or criminal justice or climate change or ocean conservation. Like, just find the thing you want to go make a dent in, because like we got a lot of problems in the world, and we need good creative people to go out and fix them. And each of these problems needs really diverse solutions, right? So it's like climate change won't just be solved by scientists, and it won't just be solved by technologists or creatives. It needs that blend. And so to me, like, the sooner you find your thing that you're like, this is where I want to make an impact, and the sooner you apply yourself to that, bringing whatever it is that you have to it. I like the ocean thing is always really interesting, because you meet so many people who are like, oh, I want to work in ocean conservation, and they immediately think they need to go become a marine biologist. And you're like,
Right.
yeah, I mean, you could if you wanted to, but like there's also like a zillion other paths into this work. And so Buckminster Fuller, for me, and this whole concept of spaceship Earth, is such a beautiful way to look at it. It's like, yeah, like what role are you going to play on that spaceship?
Yeah, and you need to step into that wholeheartedly. But again, it goes back to our previous point, where we get caught up in the inertia of life and the momentum of life, and checking all the boxes and showing up for work at this time and eating dinner and lunch at this time, and there's those are luxuries. Thinking is a luxury
Yeah.
that not everybody has, and we get wrapped
Yeah.
up in that. And when we can realize that we all are part of a spaceship, right? We're just on a spaceship. Just because it's because we have spaceships on the spaceship doesn't mean it's not a spaceship.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you can recognize that you do have a role to play, to contribute, and what is that? And not everybody's role is the same, and that's okay. And that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, is that we're all in these weird, different, little nuanced individuals, human beings, and we all are a part of a bigger picture. And your contribution to that is where you lie, and that's where your uniqueness lies, and that's where you can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think I ran a workshop a couple months ago for Surfrider Foundation. And so they have this amazing group of activists, and they're called their coastal defenders, right? So their role within all the different places they work. So this was the Europe team. These people are like on the ground fighting the good fight, right? Like whether it's ocean pollution or coastal developments, whatever. And so they asked me to go run a workshop for them. And I was like, what would be most useful? And this was for the leadership, right? So it was for the people who are supporting the coastal defenders. And so I ended up running a workshop on self-efficacy, because I have totally geeked out on self-efficacy over the last year, primarily because I've been writing some curriculum, like environmental education curriculum, and it's proven that self-efficacy is one of the drivers of like pro-ecological behavior, which is like this, the definition of self-efficacy is like one's belief that we can achieve a certain task, right? And if you believe that you can achieve a certain task, you're much more likely to be able to achieve it. But the thing that I found really interesting when I was researching for this workshop was that there are these four kind of sources of self-efficacy, or four things that you can do to increase your levels of self-efficacy. Let me see if I can remember them now. So the first one was mastery experiences, right? So like learning the thing, right? Learning and becoming a master at something. Like when we're able to master a specific experience, and it could be the simplest thing. It could be like mastering, I don't know, drawing something particular, or cooking something, or learning how to use a camera properly, whatever. Like when you take on more experiences and you master them, your self-efficacy goes up. And then the next one is vicarious experiences. So like seeing other people achieve the thing that you want to achieve, and for me, that's super important, as in surrounding yourself and putting yourself in the way of other people who are achieving the things that you want to achieve. And then let me try to remember. Then the next one is verbal persuasion. So this is like having that support crew around you who are rallying around you to make sure that you actually can have that sense of self-worth and self-belief in those moments where you might be struggling a little bit, right? So the verbal persuasion is super important. And then the last one is psychological and physiological state. So it's not changing your state, but it's being aware of your state. So the best example I can give is like, let's say you're about to get on stage and do like some public speaking, and you are about to get on and you feel this, like you physiologically, like you feel this feeling in your chest and you're like breathing a little bit faster and everything. Someone with high levels of self-efficacy will take that knowledge and be like, pretty excited, pretty ramped up, I'm ready to go. Someone else would have those exact same feelings and make those feelings mean something else. They make them be like, oh my God, I'm panicking, I'm not ready, I shouldn't do this,
Right. Abort.
Yeah, get out. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, if you know that those are the four kind of main drivers of self-efficacy, like what can you do to be working on all of them and you could be doing them simultaneously. But what excites me is when I work with people, and the people I admire the most are people with really high levels of self-efficacy. Like they're the people who are crazy enough to think that they can solve something massive, and crazy enough to think that they are going to have a really big dent in whatever cause they're working in. And I think that you see it in, at least I feel like I see it. I feel like I sense it. I can feel the energy coming from someone who has that sense of agency and that drive, and that I almost see it's like electric. I think, that spark when someone talks about something they really, really care about. I think you become somewhat unstoppable when you've got that,
Well, it becomes your guiding light, and when you could lean into that space and surrounding yourself, and all of those are so important to the bigger picture, right? Because you do need the people around you that support you, right? Because we're all ultimately gonna fall back and default to what we know, our comfort, our convenience, the neurological pathways that we've carved out over years and years and years in thinking. And then like to the point earlier where you said about the big wave, right? When that big wave's coming in, it is about slowing it down and analyzing the body and what it's trying to communicate to you, and recognizing like, okay, like, yeah, I'm excited. And that excitement is good. Like it's the old expression of like, when you're nervous, that means you care, right? And I tell my daughter that all the time because she's 6 and she'll get nervous for a test or school, whatever. I'm like, no, that means you care about it. And that's a good thing. Like, don't use this body awareness as a negative, but we're not taught that in school. We're not taught that culturally. It's just like, okay, whatever.
And it's so nuts, isn't it? And that's like the joy, I think, of like training to be a coach, is that it's super interesting to me because I feel like I trained to be a coach and I was a coach for a few years, but I haven't done that in such a long time. But the skills that I learned are so applicable and so transferable to everything I do. And it's made me better at every part of my work. But there's so many things that I learned during that period of time. And I'm like, why did we not learn this shit at school? Like so useful of like mindset shifts and just generally self-awareness, right? Like, I think, I'm like a super fan of Gary Vaynerchuk, and he's so funny because he's like a love or hate person, right? But for me, one of the things that I think he speaks about that is so important is self-awareness, and how that is such an incredible asset to have, is like high levels of self-awareness, because then you know where your blind spots are, and you know that what your triggers are, and it's, you're still human, you still have those things, but like at least you can be like, oh, I screwed up because I got triggered by this thing, and that caused me to act in this way, and I think that those levels of like emotional intelligence are so vital, and I really hope that we can start to integrate that into the education system, because it's so valuable.
Yeah, it's matrixing your emotions and realizing that you can slow down. And for me, that was a very big line of demarcation in my own growth of my mind, was when I was able to separate, when I had the opportunity to react or respond. And realizing that I'm in control of I'm not in control of the situation, but and it's Viktor Frankl's book, right? Like, you're in 4 concentration camps. How do you survive that? Well, you could react, and everything could bring you down into, yourself, really. Or you could respond and just be aware, this is my circumstance. And I'm not saying that, life is a concentration camp. That's a very extreme circumstance, but you get the idea, is that like you have the opportunity to respond to life. And that awareness is so, I mean, it's a game changer. It's a superpower, realistically.
Superpower, totally. And like even when you were talking about your daughter, like, to me, it's like, it's such an incredible lesson to teach her at that age. You know what I mean? Like, amazing. Like, in effect, you're teaching her one of those drivers of self-efficacy, which is like, understand what's happening in your body and then interpret it the right way. You know what I mean? Like, it's so powerful. It's just, I think it's incredible. And I think that is one of the benefits, I guess, of people having a little bit more downtime in the last year, is like, hopefully for some people it probably has been a bumpy ride, but there's been heightened levels of self-awareness. People are becoming, it's almost like, I feel like the last year has turned the volume up for everyone in some area of their life. It's like you haven't been able to ignore things that maybe you were able to ignore before.
Yeah, well, you're again, you're in this vacuum of existence, right? Of this reality, whether it be a float tank is no different, right? This is just another version of the float tank, where now you're handling everything in the best of your ability, to the capacities, and recognizing them. And I had a moment the other day with her where we went out the house for whatever, we had to go return some stuff. We went to Target, and we like got the cart filled up with a bunch of crap that we kind of need for the house, but it wasn't a big deal. And it was the 4 of us. And, the line was crazy. I'm like, I'm putting everything back. I put everything back. Right?
Yeah.
We get to the elevator, we're leaving, and in her little tone, she looks at my wife and goes, well, that was a waste of time. And I was like, I wanted to grab her and just say, like, shut up. Like, that's the God's to honest, like, full transparency. I wanted to grab her and just say, shut up. And the thought went from my mind, and I filtered it through my eyes by looking at her. I filtered it through my heart and saying, like, is that going to fuck her up? Like, having her father tell her to shut up. And I filtered it through my gut. And I just went down on both knees. I went eye to eye with her, and I said, please stop. Just stop right now. And she got the message, because like the rest of the ride was very different energetically. But in that moment, I had a choice, right? I had a choice that maybe we don't recognize that we have all the time, where I could have just reacted and said, and trust me, I'm not always the calmest person, but in that moment I had a choice to tell her to shut up, right? And that's not how I want her to be, spoken to by anybody, right? Especially her father. Or I could just slow things down to the point earlier and respond and just stop. Please just stop.
Yeah.
Because it was a complete waste of time.
Yeah, you're like, you're right.
You're right, little 6-year-old. That was a waste of time.
That's so funny.
Thanks for bringing it to my awareness. I appreciate that. Where can people make a difference? And again, we kind of spoke about it, but like, on what are some things that people could implement into their lives that contributes to the cause of protecting the ocean and freeing Jersey of plastic, whether it be New Jersey or your Jersey?
I mean, I think you have to find your way in. You know what I mean? Like, but the ocean is a big place, and ocean conservation is also a massive issue. And so there are lots of different things. And I found it really interesting over the last few years. So I founded Plastic Free Jersey with two friends of mine a few years ago. And the ocean plastic issue is a really interesting one because it is a huge issue, but it is by no means the biggest issue that the ocean is facing right now. But it seems to be
what is the biggest issue?
Climate change. Yeah, climate change, as in the warming of the oceans, right? And ocean acidification. But like, for some reason, everyone's grabbed hold of ocean plastic. And I think we can learn a lot from that, because I think the reason everyone's grabbed hold of it is it's very tangible.
Exactly.
Like, we can see it. We understand that it's not right. But probably the most important thing is, like, it feels like we could actually do something to stop it. Like, personally, from an individual point of view, it's like, well, I could switch from this coffee cup to this one, or I could stop buying plastic bottles, or I could get a metal straw, or whatever. And I found it amazing to see people who I would never have put on like the spectrum of environmentalists of going, I could do that, you know, and they feel quite good about themselves, and they're like, oh, this is cool. And so we, in our work, we always say that ocean plastic is like the gateway drug. Ocean conservation. We're like, yeah, we'll bring you in through the plastic, and then we'll tell you about the other big stuff, you know.
First one's free.
Yeah. So what I would say is, like, find your thing within ocean. So whether it is ocean plastic, or whether it's, you know, maybe you're like massively into whales or turtles, or maybe you have like been lucky enough to go somewhere where you could snorkel over a coral reef, and maybe it's reef restoration. So pick like a specific thing rather than the whole thing, because the whole thing is kind of overwhelming. And then, like, to me, the biggest thing is like educate yourself. Like, there are so many incredible documentaries that you can watch, and people that you can listen to, and podcasts that you can hear, and books you can read, and then find, if you can you find a way to connect that back to your local area? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there something going on in your local area? And I think there's a big disconnect for a lot of people when they live inland. They're like, oh, ocean, that's not me. But it's like, if you remember learning the water cycle when you were at school, it's like, oh yeah, it's all connected, you know? So it's just finding what is most relevant to you, what's most interesting to you, and then find a way in. And what's amazing is there are incredible ocean advocates everywhere around the world. So like, tap into that community locally and see how you can get involved. And it might be like, you know, it's like I was saying before, it's like helping out in the way that you can help out. So if you're a creative and you're amazing at art, like, offer up your skills as an artist, you know, or if you're a musician, or if you're amazing at tech, like, God knows, like, some of these nonprofits need support in terms of tech and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's just like turning your radar on within that specific area, learning about it, talking to people, kind of putting yourself in the way of it, and offering your services, whatever that is, time, energy, skills, to kind of get involved, and then go from there, you know?
Yeah. Again, my daughter hates the metal straws, but she has the rubber ones, and she's like, I don't like these either. I'm like, well, you need a straw, and we're not using plastic in this house.
Yeah.
And again, it goes to the point earlier where it's just, when you operate in that smaller level, it does end up emanating, right? And it's energy, right? And if you can elude that, if you can give that energy off, it becomes contagious. And that spreads throughout, and that's how we do make a bigger difference and make the world a better place.
Yes, totally agree.
Linzi, where can people get more information? Where can people connect with you? Where can people get your services?
So I guess two main places, two websites at least. So my website, linzihawkin.com, Protect Blue, which is the agency, which is just protect.blue, super simple. And then both of those places on Instagram. So at Linzi Hawkin and then at protect.blue. And like any, you know, I think protect.blue, we are such a niche agency, but if you want to learn about some cool ocean stuff, then that's the place to come. And then on my site and on my Instagram, I love to write. I feel like I don't get anywhere near enough time to write, but I love to write. And so that's where you'll find most of my writing and ranting / writing about environmental stuff, or kind of entrepreneurship, or just generally life stuff. So that's probably the best place to find me.
Linzi, thank you so much for your time. It was great having a conversation with you. I really appreciate it. I know we were trying to get this going and I'm glad we were able to get our paths crossed.
Yeah, so good. So good to chat.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, and continue showing up the way you are.
Yeah, I will do. You too.
Be well.
Thanks, Vin.